I just woke up here and it just freaked me out because, you start getting all the memories and everything. And he was so important to the 90s and even what pro wrestling evolved into, I mean, and sometimes I don't necessarily even think it was, the best thing, but it changed. And, I mean, like with, proliferation of the barbed wire and the death, he was the king of the death matches. I mean, never had that title, but that evolution of from that aspect of ECW, which was a key part of it. And then he evolved into all these other promotions. And he was the godfather of it in every way. And he was a guy who, I think like right now, all of a sudden everyone's going to go, yeah, you know what? Like he was so important. And if you take him out, like there's guys that were big stars, but you take them out and, the business is kind of going to be the same either way. With Sabu, the product of wrestling all over the world, I mean, Onita would have done his stuff before Sabu, but Sabu really popularized it in so many ways in the United States. When he came in the 90s, before ECW, when he started doing the independents first in the Michigan area and then started getting a name and going to other places, he was like a revelation in the business because he worked so hard, going through the tables. That was like a big part of his thing. And it was something that had been done on very rare occasions in wrestling. It was not a regular thing. Now it's a very regular thing in big matches as you have a bunch of table spots. And, he started it and he, got really upset when other people started doing it because he thought that was his gimmick. And he, went through hard and he didn't, I remember like very early on, they go like, how come you don't, put more padding on? He goes, because then people would, like you will say, oh, it's not that tough. He wanted it to be tough. He gave a lot of himself physically and without, in the big picture, great return. Terry Funk and I talked about Sabu. Terry was very influenced by Sabu, even though Terry was much older and he was the veteran. But, if you watch Terry's style after Sabu, he started doing stuff that Sabu did, as a way to keep himself relevant in his early to mid 50s, both in Japan and in the United States and became the hardcore legend, Mick Foley as well. I mean, they did all that stuff, but Sabu was like the pioneer for that. And then when he got with Paul Heyman in ECW, he was the guy in ECW when it first really started kicking in. I mean, there were other people, but they were like regular, Shane Douglas was a wrestler, Terry was a legend, but Sabu was that freaky thing where that dangerous aura, with the, when Paul would bring him out with the straight jacket and the handlers and everything. And it was, one of Paul's great innovations, and Sabu hated it, but Paul was like, look, it's different. He thought it was too much of a gimmick. It's different. It's going to get you over. And, I mean, before, people will say like the biggest star in ECW is probably Van Dam, but Van Dam came, Sabu set the foundation and then Van Dam came. And there's others, it was a whole, the Dudleys and Dreamer and the whole crew Taz, everyone knows. But Sabu was really the one and that made ECW different from everybody else. And they really harnessed him. And when he would go to WCW and WWE, they would never push him as much. A lot of the veterans probably didn't want to do what he did, understandably. And they didn't want a guy like him to be the norm of what a main event match is because it made it a lot more punishing. So he was kind of kept at a certain level. And, I mean, that was kind of what it was. And he, that style, he picked up a lot of injuries. He went for a long time, just had his retirement match at WrestleMania weekend with Joey Janela, which, I wish I went now, but that's how it goes. And then I know, he was in I had heard from a friend of his who was with him in Philadelphia last Saturday and said, he wasn't bad, but I mean, Sabu had a lot of issues from, the painkillers from what he did.
He did take what looked like a bad bump in that match too, where he kind of fell backwards to the floor.
And he's 60 years old, I mean, I know he hadn't wrestled in years, but, again, like it's a hard thing to deal with because, all of that stuff, there's a, whatever. It's like,
60 years old is not old.
it's not old at all, but he did a lot. And I mean, it took its toll, to say the least, on the guy. And, I mean, it's just, it's like a sad reminder of the pain that these guys go through to entertain people. And, he was like, I always thought like he was one of the mentally toughest guys. When he first broke in, that's what the people would tell me, is like, man, it's like, he is so mentally tough to be able to go out there. And he every show he had to do it because that was the gimmick. The gimmick was that he worked harder than everybody else. And when he would do the indie shows, like he had to have that great match, and his style allowed him to do it because it was like the first time people saw it. So it's like, it's something really, fantastic when you see it for the first time. And, I mean, people were, people saw like as an indie wrestler, he almost won Wrestler of the Year in the Observer poll, which is just unbelievable, for an indie wrestler, especially American indie wrestler, to do that. Came very close to first place. And, I mean, again, he had what was incredible for the time, and then everybody did it after him. And when everyone else started doing it, he became less unique in doing it, and he picked up the injuries. And by the time, the big money was there. I mean, he didn't quite get that big money during the late 90s run that perhaps he could have had things worked out differently. I mean, he was, he was made in ECW, and ECW wasn't a place where you could make giant money. And again, he had his issues with people there, and obviously, I mean, I remember when he did the deal where he had a New Japan booking and ECW booking at the same time. And, he took the New Japan booking, and Paul buried him and everyone. And it was like, he'll never work here again. And then a couple months later, there he was, and the place went completely nuts. And, he became to a generation of wrestlers. There's the hardcore wrestlers, it's like people will talk about Mick Foley and Terry Funk, but I think Sabu maybe meant more as far as the evolution of the game than they did. They were more Terry Funk, obviously the complete performer and everything like that, was something different. And Mick, became just this giant star and did stuff on the WWE stage, where people really remembered it. And Sabu's stuff was kind of that underground thing. But he was, when you look at the hardcore promotions, from the CZWs and GCWs and all of the things that were really inspired by ECW, Paul Heyman obviously is very, very important in this and everything. But the Sabu style allowed Paul Heyman to have something on his cards that he then, with the Dudleys and Public Enemy and other people, did it afterwards. But I don't know that if Sabu doesn't come up with this style of building to table breaks, that somebody else comes up with it. I mean, perhaps people will do it, and I mean, there it had been done in the past. I mean, a relatively few times before Sabu popularized it, and then all the flying maneuvers and all the dangerous maneuvers and everything. He did so many dangerous things. But man, it's tough. It's a tough one to think about, out of nowhere, even though, like, again, I mean, I guess, we're still, like, as far as like what happened, I don't really want to talk about it yet because we don't have anything official. I think it just happened this morning. I think what is 6:30 a.m. Is that what the story is?
I don't know. I know I got a text at like 9 or something this morning, or maybe a little bit later than that, saying. But I didn't see.
Yeah, I heard 6:30 this morning, but that could be wrong. I mean, I basically just woke up and was going through my text, so I don't really know much else on it.
You tweeted about Terry Funk, and him talking about Sabu's influence on his career. Go a little bit more into that tweet, because I thought that one was pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, Terry Funk and I used to talk about Sabu every year during the Hall of Fame, voting, because Terry always voted for Sabu and always got mad that he didn't get more support because he felt that, Sabu gave so much of him. I think Terry really, like, number one, he was very influenced by him. Number two, he, a lot of people, because Sabu was different. And a lot of people, when you have different, you're going to have your veterans and everything going like, that's not wrestling, that's garbage and everything. And Terry was always the opposite. Okay. He saw it as a, something new way to do it. It's working. I'm going to learn from it, adapt to it. And that's what he did. Terry became, he was, Terry, I guess, started really with the hardcore thing. He was doing hardcore wrestling and blood matches, but that's very different, like what the Sheik did, and Abdullah and all them. They did the heavy blood, but they didn't do what Sabu did. They did the heavy blood and brawling. Sabu did the stunts. And, I remember first, really, it was FMW where I first started hearing about Sabu, along with the Michigan Indies, right around the same time. He just got into FMW. I think he first went with the Sheik, and then made it on his own. And I remember I saw Sheik and Sabu as a tag team there, and Sabu already had the rep by then, when I saw him. But it was, Sheik was the star, and Sabu did all the work, because she couldn't do much of anything other than, the fire, because he was old, but he was such a huge star. And here's the obviously most people know Sheik was his uncle. And the other thing is that the Dark Side of the Ring with Sheik was going to air on Tuesday, which makes this a very weird irony. And
right.
I think Sabu was, I think I just saw clips this morning of Sabu being interviewed. With Sabu, it was weird because Sheik never talked. Okay. That was the thing. Sheik never talked except for a few people. And Sabu wanted to be like Sheik, that's what his thing was. But he was, he did all the blood like Sheik. But, he did much more in the ring than Sheik. But I think that was his idea, that Sheik was this giant, larger than life star, and he wanted to be like that. The Sheik obviously was a giant mainstream draw at a level that Sabu never got to be, just because of the nature of many different things, just different world, when between the 1970s and the 1990s. So that's where he kind of got the name, and the rep in Japan was, we would see the photos of him doing all of these crazy things in photos. And I think to some people, it was like, you would see the Sheik stuff, and the Sabu stuff in the magazines, or you would hear about it from your friends. Like, I would get calls, oh my God, I saw Sheik in front of 300 people and wherever, right? And he had this incredible match, and they're going through this. He went through this table, and it was so new and different. And, and that reputation spread, and he started getting indie bookings in different places. And, and then the ECW thing, obviously, as I said, made him much bigger. And, I don't know. It's sometimes I think that if he had left ECW, but like WCW is an example, by the time they picked him up, it already evolved that so many other people were doing it. So he wasn't unique anymore. And when he did it, in WWE, it was almost like the table spot became, I don't say comedy, but it wasn't the same. And when he was in, WWE and WCW, he didn't they didn't book him as a top guy. He didn't feel like a top guy. But again, the first for ECW, the Sheik, the Sabu was the top guy, and then Taz chasing the Sheik. That was the first pay-per-view, main event in a lot of ways. Sabu and Taz. They had other matches on the show, including Terry Funk's quest for the world title. But Sabu and Taz was the one that Paul had been building for, I don't know. It's a year or more. it was like this was a long-term build. He was going to save it for the first pay-per-view, and it took a long time for him to get that pay-per-view, barely legal. And so, and the pay-per-view did, 60,000 buys for a pay-per-view in that era when you're an independent show the size of ECW before they were on national TV. I mean, that, and internet wasn't what it is now. I mean, they did more than, what was the one, the original All In. And, think of how big that show was on the underground community. I mean, it didn't do as big as the AEW shows.
But on the ECW thing, so I think, when ECW comes around, I am a teenager, late stage teenager, but my pro wrestling fandom is dropping because WWF is going through the post Hogan transition. WCW had never been less popular in my lifetime at this time. And so then
you're talking like before 95, 96, when everything was in the gutter, basically.
Right. So there's this small opening for an alternative or a new style of wrestling in the US, which becomes ECW, and it fits this niche of wrestling fandom who basically want more than what they are getting from the two big companies. And like people who watch wrestling nowadays, and you sort of take for granted how easy it is to watch things. I had no access to ECW living out here in the Bay Area. Like, I wasn't into the tape trading thing at that point. So I was like, the only way I would follow it is if, someone talked about it. I wasn't even an Observer subscriber at that point. But explain kind of from the historical standpoint of where we are with WWF and WCW, which allows for this, this company to come along and just be the alternative, be like punk rock for a wrestling fan who is desperate for something that the other two companies aren't giving them.
Yeah. It's funny because like, what's it saying that's a saying I remember Gene Okerlund used to say it, that the darkest time is just before dawn. And like 1993 wrestling in the United States was at a really low level. It was probably the lowest level of popularity in my lifetime, I would say. WWF was not doing well. WCW was doing terribly. And people, the wrestling fans were there. They just weren't getting an innovative product. Smoky Mountain Wrestling was kind of capturing the fancy of some people as well. It was just a different thing. I mean, Smoky Mountain Wrestling had months where they outdrew WCW. That's how bad WCW was doing. But ECW, and it's funny, ECW didn't draw that big right away, but it became this legendary cult thing. And, Heyman and Todd Gordon, they produced something big. But Sabu was like, again, the key to kicking it all off to me was Sabu. I think it still would have done okay because Paul was a genius, but Sabu was like his Frankenstein, like his great creation that, you had to see him, and you had to see him like with Mick Foley, you know what I mean? Like that was like the dream match. Like I remember when they had their first match, it was almost like I remember some people even being disappointed, and they really killed themselves in that match because they were so afraid of disappointing people, because people wanted to see this all-time epic match. So they took all of these chances. And, Sabu, he broke his neck, I think, in a match with Benoit. And when Benoit dropped him on his head and, came back right away, or, pretty ridiculously quick. And he was just, he was bound and determined to be something, that to be somebody and something and be a star and, be the star that his uncle was, and again, not talk like his uncle, but just be, the blood, the weapons, the barbed wire, which had been used in wrestling before, but, was used a lot more in ECW. They used to call it Barbed Wire City because other people did barbed wire very rarely. ECW, God, that barbed wire match with, I think it was Sabu and Terry Funk. And I was like, what's Terry doing this? You know what I mean? At his age and his stature and his genius of wrestling. and he's doing this thing where the barbed wire was so wrapped up in him that they had to like pick it off him, and it was everything. But it's like, once I, in hindsight, when I look back at Terry, it's like I get what it was with him, because Terry was so giving, and just wanted the fans to be entertained by something new. And, Sabu was a guy he could do that with. But yeah, I mean, I think, there'll be a lot of people this week, obviously, thinking about the influence of Sabu, because it happened. We're all aware of it, but it was kind of like it was a couple of year thing, and everyone's kind of copied it. And this is just the norm, of everything. And, sometimes even people would go, and I would get it, like when I would say like, oh, Sabu's like one of the best wrestlers in the world. And then like wrestlers themselves were just like, to them, that wasn't wrestling. But it's what wrestling turned into. And was he, he wasn't the smoothest, or, like if you talk about compared to Bret, and I compared him to Bret, but not like, obviously what Bret did was fantastic. But Sabu at the time just would blow your socks off with stuff that had never been seen before. And, that's why if you look for a couple year period there, if you look back at the Observer Awards, for most outstanding or flyer or even wrestler of the year, he took second, and a close second one year. Again, and I think that was fairly early in his run when he did that. People just were blown away by him. And people would go to see, it wasn't like a large number of people would go to see him on these indie shows, but they would go to see him, and they would come back with, oh my God, you won't believe what I saw, because it was something that they'd never seen before. But that, again, man, that stuff in time, the punishment that he put on his body takes its toll, and, the things happen. And, Sabu, he had a lot of, scary moments. I mean, like people would bring him in and he'd be in rough shape. And, there's all the horror stories. Everyone knows that there were many horror stories before. And it's kind of, he lived through them. And since he was out of wrestling, you kind of hope that, now that he's out of wrestling, we're not going to see and hear them. But then, and also the other thing too is, he went through some major heartbreak, with, his I don't know, it was his girlfriend or whatever. I don't know if they were married or not, but, when she passed away, that was years ago, but, at a very young age, and that just has to take a toll on you as well, and it was, and the other part too is like, it's so hard when you're so consumed in something, and then your career winds down. His body just couldn't do it anymore, and the demand for him was more on a cult level at that point. Like if you saw him once every couple of years, it's kind of like that nostalgia. Hey, there's Sabu, like at GCW, this over Mania week. And that was a big match there for a lot of people, because it was Sabu hadn't wrestled in years and years and years. Was his retirement match, obviously, and probably for real, because he hadn't wrestled in years. They talked him into doing it. He takes that big bump, but his body's thrashed, and it's I feel really bad for the people who obviously they were, he was a big part of a lot of people's fandom early on, for new fans, and even for older fans who some it's like when you do change new things, there's always going to be people who just really like love it, and there's going to be people who don't like it because it's new and it's not what the veterans wanted wrestling to turn into. And and it's a dangerous thing. Sometimes I think back and it's like, oh, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have people going, we want tables, which, obviously started in the ECW during every big match, because they're sitting there wanting people to pull out tables.
That chant started like 5 minutes into the four-way for absolutely no reason last night.
Yeah. And they were having a hell of a match too.
Yes. I was like, why?
I know. And but that's that's what it evolved into. And it's not just Sabu. I mean, Paul's really the one who pushed it. Like if it was Sabu, if Sabu had his way, it was like my gimmick is breaking tables, and nobody else should break tables because that's my gimmick. And it really he got very mad when Paul let everyone do it because it made him less special and it made him more expendable. And they didn't, after a while, they didn't need Sabu because that aspect of their game, other guys, everybody was going through tables there. But he was the pioneer of a lot of what we see. He changed the business. Is it good or is it bad? It's both. I just feel bad that obviously that he passed away. I mean, I didn't know him, and he was hard to know for a lot of people. He was funny. I know that. When he would talk and everything like that on his interviews, you could see he obviously was very consumed and thought very much about what he did. And so, yeah, but it's like, it's a weird thing because I feel it's like this part of history. And it is. It's that early 90s wrestling needs a shot in the arm because whatever they're doing, like you said, WWF was trying to figure out its way after Hogan, and people were so into the muscle guys, and because of the the steroid crackdown and steroid testing, you couldn't have that anymore. So people had to learn a new wrestling. WCW was just doing terrible. ECW kind of rises from that. Independent wrestling rises from that. I mean, independent wrestling was never big. It was always territories and everything like that, but independent wrestling was never a big deal. And Sabu was really like the first. I could be wrong, but I guess I would say when I first really saw independent wrestling rise, it was late. It would have been prior to Sabu because it was Bruiser Brody and Sergeant Slaughter, and other people who would be between gigs. But those would be like, I think those were like the two big ones. Brody worked a lot of dates because he charged a lot less. Sarge had the big name, so he charged a lot more. Probably a bigger drawing card, but he didn't, Sarge was kind of just going through, doing his cheerleading and everything. And he got his he was just doing it. Brody would go out there and kick ass every night. And, he revitalized, he was the real first one. And then I think that the Sabu generation was the next one, but that's when you started really seeing more and more independent wrestling and more coverage of independent wrestling. Because again, like in the territory days, you didn't really have independent wrestling because, you had your territory and nobody went against you. And if they did, they were at such a low level and everybody tried to knock them out, with the Brody independent stuff, the territories were kind of falling apart. And he was able to, make a living between Japan tours doing that, which we didn't necessarily even have to do because he was making a lot of money in Japan on his own, like Stan. And Stan didn't do it, that much, a little bit here and there. But Brody did it constantly. And then, Brody died. And then it picked up with, it was around for the next couple of years. I mean, that pretty much, with people who were between gigs and whatever. But then the Sabu became like the new revelation of independent wrestling. And
So WWE with Raw tomorrow, hopefully they have some graphic and a mention of him. But I imagine
everyone has to.
I imagine Tony Khan being
without doubt.
And plus they have these shows coming up from that they're going to do the residency. Like there's going to be a lot of opportunity for him to pay respects to Sabu.
I will say this. I think that, as that weird coincidence is, he's doing the tribute to McMichael. So it's kind of hard after you've announced that to do something this quick. And the fact that he does have all those shows in Philadelphia, I think that 2300 Arena is the place to do it. And, I know, obviously everyone knows the story of Tony Khan when he was 13 years old and he did really good in a test, and his dad said, whatever you want. And you can have anything, right? And he goes, I want you to take me to the ECW arena. to see wrestling. And I don't know if Sabu was on that show. I've never really asked him like what show it was. I just know it was ECW. But Sabu would have been, a big part of it. So in Tony Khan's life, it's a big deal. I would think, he may do something sooner, but when I think about it, it's like, I think that he should do a kick-ass tribute to Sabu show. The first week that he's there, I don't know if it has to be the first night, but maybe not even necessarily on the Ring of Honor show, maybe better on a Collision show, or maybe, whatever. But yeah, I think, and I'm sure he will, again, I haven't talked to him since this thing happened or contacted him because I literally just woke up and, read a couple texts and got a hold of you. But I do think that I don't want to put pressure on something, but I think he'll do it. It's, again, like, it's interesting because, John Muse just had texted me and goes, I've been really studying the Sabu Hall of Fame case, and it's for influence. It's there, for the other reasons, like he wasn't this giant national star, like a Randy Orton or somebody like that. And he wasn't this super wrestler like, a Will Ospreay or a Kenny Omega. But he was, his influences, right? When I think of like, who are the most influential people, and, it's like, obviously like, Hogan and Flair and Road Warriors to a degree. And, Rey Mysterio, of course, super influential in the United States wrestling. But Sabu is like right up there, more than people who were much, much, much bigger national names, more famous names than Sabu. He was more influential in this business, changed the business. Again, and the whole, he was the guy that really first put ECW on the map. And then all these people who grew up watching ECW and wanting to be an ECW wrestler on the independent scene, all the deathmatch guys and the promoters of deathmatch wrestling and all that, it's just like his legacy in that sense is gigantic.